Our final TED Talk speaker this morning is Adam Graham. Adam Graham is a crisis and clinical consultant with TBD Solutions, working with community mental health and crisis systems across the country to launch, improve, and innovate services. Adam draws on a history of 14 years in community mental health in Nashville, Tennessee, including as the Director of Emergency Psychiatric Services and as a mental health consultant for the FBI. In addition to direct crisis experience, Adam worked as a threat mitigation specialist for Google, served a year in international aid, 2 years in private practice, and is beginning his 3rd year as an adjunct professor with Vanderbilt University's graduate counseling program. His talk is called The Impossible Line. Please welcome Adam Graham.
Where do you draw the line between what is impossible and what is possible? It can be harder than you think. Take, for instance, lava. Is it possible to touch lava and be okay? Well, as my man Arkadzi here is about to demonstrate, there's a thing called the Leidenfrost effect. And it's very possible to touch lava and be okay. When water vaporizes on your hand, it creates an insulating barrier, temporarily protecting you from extremes, even such as lava. Let's take one closer to home. Is it possible to shatter a glass using only your voice? Absolutely possible. 550 hertz at 100 decibels, well within the range of a trained vocalist, will shatter a wine glass. One more. Is it possible to hum while holding your nose? Well, go ahead and try. It's actually impossible. And as difficult as it is to draw this line of what's impossible and what's possible, as individuals and as teams and as agencies, we have to do this day in and day out. And the consequences can be significant. Take, for instance, if you try to attempt the impossible. It can feel bold, exciting, innovative, and the results can be disastrous. Take, for instance, Todd. Todd believed that it was impossible to have his identity stolen when it was protected by his company, LifeLock. He believed it so much that he released his social security number to the internet. Todd had his identity stolen 13 times, and his company was fined $12 million for false advertising. Needless to say, Todd's no longer in the securities business. But on a less drastic scale, if you have an ongoing agenda item in your weekly meeting that's impossible, that is, the reality is that thing being done is impossible, and your expectation is that it can be done, that gap between the expectation and the reality is disappointment, which very easily leads to an ongoing agenda item of frustration and bitterness. What about on the other side? It may feel safer to say, well, not attempting the possible wouldn't be as bad, and so let's err on that side, but it's not actually safer, it's just a different set of problems. Let me tell you what I mean. Let's go back to 1975. It was a major year in American innovation. Lots of big inventions like Pop Rocks, and Whack-A-Mole, and the digital camera. Did you know this? This is Steve Sasson. And in 1975, he created the world's first digital camera, and as he shared in an interview later, he was told by leadership at Kodak, where he worked, that's cute, but don't tell anybody. 6 years later, they did market research and said, yes, it is possible for the digital camera to replace film cameras in 10 years. And Kodak was the only group that had it. But they believed that's impossible. Digital cameras will never replace film cameras. Fast forward to 1989, Steve Sasson and his colleague invented the first self-contained digital camera, the prototype that was going to be launched later. Kodak had it, said that's impossible. And so in 2012, Kodak declares bankruptcy. Kodak continues as a company today, but at a 90% loss of their value. So we draw this line to separate the impossible and the possible, without knowing for sure which one it is. And there are risks either way. And as the behavioral health crisis continuum continues to grow and to evolve, the way that we do this as individuals, as teams, and as agencies will absolutely shape how the crisis continuum plays out. Let's look at the mechanisms for how this works. If we believe that something is impossible, then the next logical step is to think less about it, to talk about it less, to have less conversation, less exploration, less debate, because it's just a waste of time. The best question you can ask for something that's impossible is, what do we move on to? Take, for example, 1994, 10-year-old me realized that it was impossible for me to play in the NBA because, well, I'm short, not particularly well coordinated, and not very good at basketball. My best bet was to figure out what do I move on to, which for me was looking at space exploration and space travel. Also didn't work out. But what about on the other side? If something is possible, then the best next step is to actually think about it more, have more conversation, more debate, more exploration, and the best question to ask is, how might we do this? Take, for instance, 2018, 34-year-old me thankfully had found a better career path in mental health. And as the director of emergency psychiatric services in Nashville, the company I was with was asked to open a police drop-off center that could accept folks in under 10 minutes so that patrol officers would be more incentivized to bring people to care than to jail. Our current average was 100 minutes for a drop-off. But we believed that it was possible. And so it led to months of conversation and of exploration, of debate and arguments and iterations, and ultimately, success. But they still maintain an under 10-minute drop-off. And that's the win we're going for, right? To find and to be able to courageously and with wisdom draw that line of what is possible, even when it's difficult. Maybe saying, well, that sounds great, Adam. How do we do that? Well, I'd like to give you a visual as an answer. How many dots do you see on this? If your eyes feel like a cat chasing a laser pointer, you're not alone. It's called the extinction effect. It is impossible to see all 12 dots at the same time. It's a nice reminder that we can't see all the perspectives, all the angles, all the time, that we need help from others. And so I'd like to offer this morning the idea of the democracy of the possible when it comes to drawing the impossible line. Democracy is a great term. It's this way of making decisions vested in people. It's a Greek word, demos, meaning people, kratos, meaning power. And we're saying we're going to make the decision of where to draw the line between what's possible and impossible, not just based on myself, because I can't see all the dots, but based on a whole network of innovators across my community, across the state, across the country, across the world. That's what CrisisCon is about, right? And actually, as we think about a network of innovators and learning from them, by the numbers, most of them aren't even alive. And so we look for the democracy of the possible across time throughout history. Let me give you an example. I have colleagues who believe that it's impossible for peer-run respites to be an alternative crisis solution that is effective and sustainable. They have questions. Say, well, what if somebody wants to leave? What about ongoing funding? It's not Medicaid reimbursable. What about, or how would someone get better without a clinician and a prescriber? How does this all work? And then they stop thinking about it because they believe it's impossible. So the next best question is what do we move on to? And then many of you got to see the Promise Resource Network, the retreat. That's been open since 2021, effectively providing care where 97% of folks say they would love to come back if they ever needed it, and has been sustainable since that time. Or several of you got to hear Steve Michio talk about growing peer support in the crisis system, and he talked about his 4 and soon to be 6 Rose houses that divert thousands of days away from the hospital every year. It's a system that's been replicated over 42 times across the country and around the world, diverting hundreds of thousands of days from the hospital, boasting outcomes of at least 20% improvement in quality of life measures, and has saved the mental health system millions of dollars. It begins this picture of the democracy of the possible across the country, across the world. But let's not stop there. This handsome fella is William Tuke. And in 1791, his response to a tragedy redefined what was considered possible in crisis care. William was part of a Quaker community in England, and a member of their group, Hannah Mills, died tragically in the York Asylum from maltreatment and neglect. It was an age of violent medicine where interventions ranged from involuntary ice baths to starvation to leeching. And in response to the tragedy, William and his group decided they were going to build an alternative, one that sought to become a retreat for people to stay and rest and be treated with gentleness and respect and as the brethren that they were. So in 1796, they opened the York Retreat. They described it as a simple place with a garden, where people, instead of being starved, were fed 4 meals a day and snacks and wine at night. Where instead of involuntary ice baths, they would prescribe 20-minute warm baths, maybe up to an hour bath if the need was really there. Where they taught sewing and gardening, where they gave ample opportunity for reading and writing and chess and poetry. This is a painting of a Sunday afternoon at the York Retreat, painted by a guest at the York Retreat. And to be sure, the people who came to the York Retreat were several of those who had been deemed incurable by the medical asylums, who had spent years in the asylums. The York Retreat gave rise to the moral treatment revolution that made it over to America, where over and over again, there were treatment outcomes of over 50%, usually 60, 70%, of people leaving within a year being either significantly improved or cured. It was a forerunner to a lot of the respite models that we see today. But let's be a little bit more recent. Instead of the 1790s, let's do the 1970s. So this is Soteria House. In 1971, Dr. Lauren Mosier, who you've heard about here, who is the head of the schizophrenia division of the NIMH, decided that he wasn't satisfied with the medical model of inpatient treatment and the ample use of medication in treatment. So he opened a home and said the goal here is to provide a place of hospitality. He trained lay people to be with those experiencing first episode, second episode psychosis, and to create a place where they could belong. More recently, in 2007, the NIMH did a systematic review of the Soteria paradigm that's been replicated across the world, and look at what they found. The Soteria paradigm yields equal and in certain areas better results in the treatment of people diagnosed with first or second episode schizophrenia spectrum disorders, achieving this with a considerably lower use of medication when compared to conventional medication-based approaches. Did you know this? Did you know that Soteria has equal, if not better, results than the standard inpatient treatment program? And so we have this democracy of the possible spanning across time. And so when people ask me today, Adam, is it actually possible to run a peer-run respite that's effective and sustainable? I was like, you don't have to look to me. The answer is yes. So what do we do with this? I'd like to offer 3 brief on-ramps. First, there is this covert reality that each of us as individuals and as teams and agencies draw this line of what is possible and impossible. I'd offer to make that conversation overt. That choose to have intentional time as an individual to reflect on what do I believe is possible and why? What do I believe is impossible and why? And then have this as a team conversation, as an agency conversation, so that there's not this belief in the background driving things, but it can be a full conversation where intentional choices are made. Second, remember there's an element of choice in belief, and to choose to start with the possible. That way you lean into, let's think about it more. Let's have more conversation about this, more exploration. And if we find through that conversation that it's not possible, then we'll stop. But let's not prematurely stop good ideas by assuming, oh, that's impossible, and stop the conversation there. And finally, third, join the conversation. It's what this conference is all about. That we listen for the network of innovators across our communities, across our country, across our world, across history, for the ideas of what's being done, what can actually be done. We keep our ear to the ground. We read good books. We listen. And then we tell the good stories of what we are trying and finding is possible in our community so that others can see, oh, yeah, I think that is possible. Hopefully you've had that experience here. Because, let's make no doubt about it, we face daunting challenges ahead of us. Let's be the ones who find the way forward, who find what is possible. Thank you.
Adam Graham.